Welcome to the Biblical Languages Podcast, brought to you by Biblingo. We bring together the latest research in linguistics, language acquisition, and biblical studies to better understand the biblical languages and ultimately the biblical text. As always, this episode is brought to you by Biblingo, the premier solution for learning, maintaining, and enjoying the biblical languages. Visit biblingo.org to learn more and start your 10-day free trial.
Welcome to another episode of the Biblical Languages Podcast. This is another republished episode in our mini-series on the Greek verbal system, where I'm reviewing Campbell's book, Basics of Verbal Aspect in New Testament Greek. We also republished my episode with Nora Bonet, which I would highly recommend if you haven't already listened to it. And in this episode, Nick and I discuss how to actually interpret Greek verbs. We wanted to republish this again as a part of this series because at the end of the day, that's kind of what everyone wants. They want to know how to interpret the text. So I don't want to just critique Campbell and then not put any real positive theory forward on how to analyze the verbal system. This episode serves as at least a step in that direction. Hope you enjoy it.
This is our second of two concluding episodes for this series, and our goal is to get practical and show how this discussion of the verbal systems really has an impact on how we read the biblical text. So in our last episode, we looked at specific passages in biblical Hebrew, and in this episode, we're looking at specific passages in biblical Greek. Something we've done a lot in this whole series is talk about terminology, and specifically the categories, or what we've been calling the notional categories that we actually use to describe the verbal systems and what they're doing. And we're not going to rehash all the categories and terminology that we've discussed in previous episodes, so I think it'd be really helpful for our listeners, if you haven't listened to parts 1 through 4, to do that. But Kevin, are there any specific categories or is there any specific terminology that we really need to unpack a little bit or define before we jump into this specific conversation?
One criticism, I guess, I get a lot about the field of linguistics, I think is worth addressing. And it's specifically that linguists use terms differently between each other. And it's very hard to keep track of, how one linguist is using a technical term and how another linguist is using a technical term. So this is something that really, as I've been mulling over these questions, this kind of question, I've been thinking about why do people feel this way, right? From someone that's more inside the field, it doesn't feel like that to me. I kind of know what people are saying and what people mean by them. But I realized that a lot of times what will happen in linguistics papers is they'll take a definition and, the whole paper will be about how this particular language shows that we should revise our definition slightly to account for this notional category, right, that's represented in the morphology of this language. So the idea is that when we look at a particular language, let's say we can talk about the perfect, for example, there are perfects in different languages that behave differently. And so the idea is that might lead us to then revise how we define the perfect or nuance it, right? And I think that generates some confusion because people begin to use the terms in slightly different ways.
Right. So it's important to keep in mind that the categories work for us. We don't work for the categories. So we're not bound to one specific, concrete understanding of a specific category for eternity, but they need to be refined to be most helpful to us. And the way that they are most helpful to us is that, one, they account for all the data across languages as best as they can. And two, they help us understand each other. And the way they're going to do that is if we all have the same understanding of them, as much as we possibly can.
Yeah, right. Exactly. So I think those two things are really important. Like one is that the terms do something for us, right? And in order to make the terms do something for us, in some ways they do have to reflect meaningful distinctions in language, right? That's the whole point. So that's crucial. And then, we also have to use terms in such a way that they are consistent enough with each other, right, that we can be talking about the same thing. And this is something that I think is really important, particularly in the biblical studies realm, because terms aren't always used in the same way. Because people in biblical studies aren't in the field of linguistics. That's just not their main field. They're not linguistics teachers, professors at universities. And so sometimes they use terms in ways that aren't correct, in the sense that they aren't the way that terms would be used in the linguistics department. And I think that's a really important point, because then if you start going back and forth from the linguistics literature to the biblical studies literature, then it can get very, very confusing. And if you aren't careful, it's very easy to basically place, the one category over another, even though they use the terms differently.
So what's maybe an example of this happening specifically in the field of biblical studies, and how can understanding how terms are being used in kind of the field of linguistics proper start to refine those categories for us as people who are interested in biblical studies?
I think a really good example is aktionsart within biblical Greek studies. Let me just preface this by saying, like we said in the last episode, I think we're all on the same team here, and I'm not trying to pick a fight with anyone, but I do think it's very important that we are very clear in how, our analyses might differ from other people's, and how we're using terms might differ from other people's. So, this definition of aktionsart is from Campbell's book on introducing aspect in Greek. Campbell, in his book, describes aktionsart as the following. So this is taken from page 23. He says, aktionsart, on the other hand, is a pragmatic value. The aktionsart of a particular tense form can change. Sometimes an aorist will be punctiliar in aktionsart. Sometimes it will be iterative, sometimes ingressive. It all depends on which lexeme is used as an aorist on the context and on what actually happened. Aktionsart is cancelable. When asked, what do you do, aorist? The answer is, well, I do many things. I have many possible aktionsart outcomes. So essentially, the way Campbell defines aktionsart is the way we have often talked about on this podcast, interpretation, right? The final interpretation of a verb form. The aorist has many possible aktionsart outcomes. It's, what actually happened in the world. It's pragmatic. So all of these things suggest that the way Campbell is defining it, has to do with our interpretation of a verb. And specifically a verb with the aspect already added, right? That's the key. Whereas if you look on Wikipedia, for example, or in any linguistics textbooks, this is just a definition I got from Wikipedia, which is normally pretty good with linguistic stuff. It says the lexical aspect or aktionsart of a verb is part of the way in which that verb is structured in relation to time. Lexical aspect is invariant, but grammatical aspect can be changed according to the whims of the speaker. So the point of saying that lexical aspect is invariant is that it's not pragmatic, right? It is semantic. The way it normally works within linguistics, right, is you have a certain aktionsart value. So we've talked about this: states, achievements, activities, and accomplishments. And so that will then combine with a grammatical aspect value, let's say the perfect in Greek, right? And then that will lead to an interpretation, how we understand a certain form. Our interpretation might include the endpoint of the event or not, for example. So Campbell is saying that interpretation is aktionsart, whereas linguists would normally say that no, aktionsart is something that combines with grammatical aspect that then leads to an interpretation.
Yeah, I think that distinction is really clear. And the bottom line here is that Campbell is just using the word aktionsart differently than how it's used in the field of linguistics. Regardless of what else you want to say about the definition or his understanding, at the end of the day, it's different, and that's unhelpful for people who are trying to integrate linguistics into their understanding of the biblical Greek verbal system.
Yeah, and that's really my point. I mean, I think it is important to talk precisely about the interpretations that we can have of a clause. So, Campbell's Actionsart, it's fine that we can have a category for that. I don't think it should be named Actionsart because, I think fundamentally, right, he is trying to take Actionsart from linguistics. This is the problem. This is where the confusion comes in. He's trying to take it from linguistics and apply it to the biblical languages, but when you use it differently than linguists use it, then it gets confusing, right? So I think the bottom line is we do have to be very careful, right, about our categories, and we should be very clear. I think Campbell actually does give a clear definition of what he means by this. I don't think he means what he should mean by it. But what is important here is if we are going to go from one field to the other, then you have to recognize that when you read a linguistics paper, they're going to use Actionsart differently because no one would have Campbell's definition of Actionsart within linguistics.
And I think something that I've heard you say is that part of doing semantics, so, you can talk about semantics, but when you say doing semantics, you mean like as a linguist in the field doing the work of semantics, part of that process is refining the notional categories. And so, it seems like just an inherent disadvantage of not being immersed in the field of linguistics proper is you're getting a certain understanding of certain categories, but then those are being refined and you kind of miss that process of them being refined, and then you're a little bit behind or, have an outdated definition or something. I don't know if that's the case here, but nonetheless, if you're not immersed in the field, you're gonna be missing out on those refined categories. So, on that topic, what is the solution here? How do we even go about, whether as linguists or as people in biblical studies, how do we go about refining our notional categories? What does that process look like?
I do think it's very important that we make sure that we are getting the terms right to begin with, right? So that would be the first thing, just like very basically, what does it refer to? And, like introductory linguistics textbooks are great places for that. They have no skin in the game in any of these discussions in the verbal system. So I would just go there. And honestly, I actually think that Wikipedia is a normally good source for linguistics information. There's just lots of free information on the internet. But as far as like how we use these notional categories and refine them, it really is a huge part of linguistics. So the issue is, right, when we say something like, okay, the perfective means that the event time is included within the reference time. So then we go to our language, we go to our data, and we say, this kind of fits, but it kind of doesn't. And so we have to ask ourselves, how do we account for this sort of leftover data? And we can really do one of, three things. So we can refine our notional category. So we can just say something like, well, maybe it's still perfected. Maybe there's some sort of like kernel of truth about this idea of reference time extending beyond event time, right? Or event time being included in reference time that applies here, but we need to just tweak it, right? So that's one option. We just refine our notional category. We could change the data to fit our notional category. So this might seem, like cheating, and it might be cheating if you just say, oh, well, the data is the data. But actually, especially for us, the data is not necessarily the data because we don't have access to native speakers. So the question for us is like, is there another way to interpret this sentence that might make sense of the notional category that is maybe not the traditional interpretation, but maybe it makes sense given the context and the category, and we can then, fit it into our system. Or we can explain away the interpretation with other elements in the sentence. So we can say, you know what, maybe this aorist is behaving this way right here because of something specific in this particular context that's making it behave in that way, right? And then we would have to provide a semantics for that element and combine it with the semantics of the aorist, for example, and then that would lead to this final interpretation that we can account for. And so we'll actually do this in this episode. We'll go through some categories and some interpretations. We'll tweak notional categories, and we'll just account for sort of the leftover data in the field.
Yeah, so maybe just to kind of take some of these abstract ideas and make them more concrete with an English example would be helpful, since probably most of the people listening to this know English. Maybe we can do that before we dive into a language like Biblical Greek.
Yeah, for sure. So I think that's a great idea. So let's take an example from English will just have a minimal pair, right? So these kinds of minimal pairs are important because if we have a different interpretation between two clauses and the only difference is one element, then we can say, well, the difference is coming from that one element. So an example is, let's say Mary drank a beer when she was 7, okay? Versus Mary drank beer when she was 7. So you get two different interpretations there. So Mary drank a beer when she was 7 means that she drank a single beer, right? And this drinking event is just a one-time occurrence. She drinks the full beer and it's done, right? Versus Mary drank beer when she was 7 means that Mary had the habit of drinking beer at the age of 7. So what's crucial here is that our understanding, one of these is habitual and one is not habitual. And the only difference between the two sentences is the word a, right? So we can't say then that the habitual is coming from, the verb form. It's just not the case. The verb form didn't change. The only thing that changed is a or not a. And so the habitual interpretation is actually coming from a different element outside of the verb, right? In this case, the indefinite article or the lack thereof. So that's the kind of thing that we need to be aware of. And it shows that what we really need is a theory that takes into consideration things outside of just the verb, right? Just the aspect of the verb. That's not going to get us a comprehensive analysis of the data. It just can't, because there are more things going on in these sorts of contexts.
With this example, the verb form drank is, what we might think of as like a simple past in English. And if you ask your average native English speaker what drank means, they would, in almost every case, say that it just refers to a simple past tense event where someone drank something and they finished it. And that habitual sense of it probably wouldn't have come to mind as readily as that perfective sense of it. And so that's what we're doing here. And that's kind of what you mean by the leftover data. Like if you accumulated all the data of this kind of simple past tense verbal form in English, a lot of it, probably most of it, would be, again, that kind of simple past, like perfective sense of the verb. But then there's some leftover data of like, oh, what do we do with this Mary drank beer that doesn't fit that category as well.
Yeah, exactly. And what we should do with it here, because we have this minimal pair, is just say it has nothing to do with the simple past, right? That's the point.
Okay, so yeah, that's really helpful to have an example from English. And so this is basically what we're going to be doing for the rest of this episode, but with examples from biblical Greek. So let's go ahead and dive into that.
Yeah, so one of the kind of classic examples is the aorist, particularly in more traditional or classical Greek grammars. It's called the tragic aorist. And this is actually has been written on by a linguist named Corian Berry. She did her dissertation on aspect in classical Greek, and it's a great dissertation. And actually, quite a few semanticists have done really good work on the verbal system of ancient Greek. A few of them are Paul Kaparsky, so Corian Berry I mentioned, and von Stichow. And really, these are people that are world-class in a lot of ways, especially Kaparsky and von Stichow. They're very, very well known. But these kinds of analyses are super valuable, because here are linguists that are saying something about these specific interpretations, and they have no skin in the game. They're just trying to solve the problem, right? That's all they're trying to do. So Berry has this article about the tragic aorist. And what she notes is basically that these are performatives, and we'll define that. But here's an example from Mark 1:11. It says, "Kai phone egeneto ekton uranon, su e ho huiosmu ho agapetos, and soi eudokesa." So let me read it in English. "And a voice came from heaven, 'You are my beloved son, with you I am well pleased.'" So here we have this aorist at the end, and soi eudokesa. So this seems like, and people have said this, right? People, particularly in the discussion on tense, does the Greek verbal system have tense? And they've said, hey, look, here's the aorist. It's used in a present context. That proves that we have no tense here. And that kind of logic, might work, right? So basically what they're saying is we have this leftover data. Our definition of tense cannot account for it, right? We cannot account for this example if we just say that, the speech time comes after the reference time, right? So this is a problem. But we do have other examples with this same verb where it is in the past, right? So an example is 1 Corinthians 10:5. Al uk entois pleosin auton eudokesen hotheos. So, but with most of them, God was not pleased. And here it's very clear, right, from the translation, that it is past. So the question is, what do we do with this kind of example? And what Barry notes, and I think this is exactly correct, is that these sorts of predicates are performatives. And what we mean by a performative, so this is a term that goes back to 1962 with Austin, who was basically challenging the notion that the meaning of a sentence is its truth conditions. It's not super important, the history here, but he noted that there are some sorts of sentences that we do things with, right? And particularly we do things with when we utter them. So his examples, I hereby pronounce you man and wife. So when we say that, we are also acting at the same time. We are creating a new situation in the world, right? All of a sudden, those two people are married. So he noted some characteristics of this sort of phenomenon, and he called it performative, right? So he said that they're first person. So because the utterance is doing something in the world, the speaker has to be the one who is, saying it, and it has to be in first person. I hereby pronounce you man and wife. But you can't just say, the man pronounces you man and wife, and they're actually then married, right? I have to be the one to do it. So here in our context, we actually have that. So we have, I am pleased with you. So Barry's point is that we should analyze these kinds of uses of the aorist as a performative. And what's special about performatives is, like we said, that basically the event time coincides with the reference time. And they're both punctiliar, right? That's what's special. So we have this overlap between event time and reference time. And the fact that they're both punctiliar suggests that you would want the aspect to be perfective. Because what we want is the event time to end as we say the utterance, right? So what Barry notes is that in languages that don't have a present perfective, so Greek is one of them, and most languages actually don't, what they do is within the system, they adjust to that, right? So sometimes they'll use an imperfective with the present, but that imperfective will be interpreted perfectively just for these kinds of sentences because the system doesn't really work well for it. Or they'll use something like a past perfective because, again, the system doesn't really have a way of saying it perfectly. So they'll use a form that's close. And in this case, too, it's very hard to tell, right? The speech time and the reference time are ending at the same time, right? What this sentence means, it doesn't mean that God is no longer pleased with Jesus after the utterance. But the point is that the utterance itself is a declaration, and it is, in that sense, new news to the hearers, right? I am hereby declaring that I am pleased with you. And so in that sense, it's more of an act. It's not just saying, in general, I'm pleased with you. That would be the imperfective, right? Or the present tense, right? That's what that would mean. That's the idea.
I did just want to note that we will list some of the semanticists that Kevin has referenced in the show notes of this episode. So if you want to check out their work further, you can find them there. But so basically what we've just done with these examples, kind of going back to this task at hand of refining our notional categories, doing semantics, we found some, again, what we might call leftover data, right? An example of an aorist that isn't behaving as we might expect an aorist to behave. And before you kind of listed 3 ways that we can deal with leftover data, and it seems that we've just dealt with it. With the third way that you listed, we explain away an interpretation with other elements in the sentence. And so those other elements are, okay, it's in the first person, it has a perfective aspect, and we know that in ancient Greek that performatives behave in this way. And so we're going to interpret this as a performative in order to allow it to fit our notional category of aorist. Is that what we just did?
Yeah. The point is that we can say, okay, perfective and aorist is just event time included in reference time, and then just go on our happy way. We account for most of the data. But the issue is that there's fringe material. And the reason is, and this again goes back to our original discussion with Nora, is that languages don't have every single category neatly parsed out in the morphology. So what happens is when we want to express a certain meaning, use language in a certain way, the system adjusts slightly, right? So the aorist might not necessarily fit perfectly with, a performative meaning, right? Or at least it doesn't if you just compare it with English, right? There's no reason why we should take English to be primary over Greek here. It's actually, not easy to tell what the tense is. And that's the issue here, right? Because the event time ends with the act of speaking. That's the issue. And then, since we have these kinds of examples only in certain environments, right? It begs the question, like, what if it's the environment that's causing that interpretation and not the verb form? That's the issue at the end of the day.
Right. And I think in a previous conversation, you talked about how we don't only need to ask the question, why was this verb form used, but why was it used instead of another verb form? And so the point here is that, okay, well, maybe to us, it seems that the aorist wasn't the best choice to express this idea, but for this native speaker, they were thinking maybe something different. Okay, the present tense actually doesn't best capture what I'm trying to express here in terms of a performative. And so there's something about the aorist that captures that actually better.
Yep, exactly.
Great. Yeah, that's a really helpful example. Do we want to jump into another example here?
Yeah, so we're asking the question, does the aorist actually have tense or not? And another, counterexample is this gnomic aorist. And basically gnomic means some sort of like general truth. So we have an example in James 1:11. There's a handful of examples in the New Testament. I'll just read the first part. So it says, anetelen gar ho helios synto kausoni. So for the sun rises with its scorching heat, and it goes on, and withers the grass, its flower falls, and its beauty perishes, etc., etc. All of those are aorist. So here, again, it doesn't seem like we can fit the aorist just meaning past perfective into this interpretation. And in fact, in English, right, we just say, for the sun rises. It would be very, very odd to say, for the sun rose with its scorching heat. We just can't get the interpretation of general truth with the simple past in English, probably because it's blocked from the simple present. But the question is this a challenge for the theory that the epsilon is past tense? And I actually think, as I've been, mulling over these kinds of examples, if you think about gnomic truths, like general truths, it's really a problem for tense, right? It's not a problem for past tense. It's a problem for tense. So the issue is that when we say something is future, right, we mean that it takes place in the future. When we say something is present, we mean it's taking place in the present. There's really no reason why we should generalize the present to all time, right? And in fact, we don't normally do that. When we say something is present, even if it's a present state, we don't necessarily mean, and this applies to all time, right? But these sorts of general truths like the sun rising actually does apply to all time. So it's not as much a problem for tense. Well, it is a problem, right? But it's, in a lot of ways, it's just as much of a problem for past tense as it is for present tense, as it is for future tense, right? I think the bigger issue here is actually the perfective. And I think this is actually why it's used here. So if you look at each of these events, they are all telic. The sun rises, so it actually goes up and it reaches height in the sky. Grass withers, it changes, its flower falls, and its beauty perishes. All of these are telic. And so if you think, how do we express general truths that are telic events, right? And we want to make sure that the reader understands, or the hearer understands, that the end point is reached. So tense, we've already said, in these kinds of clauses, tense is kind of negated. It's not present, it's not future, it's not past. It's just kind of gone. But what is important is perfective in the sense that telic events are reached, right? So we have these sorts of telic events reached. And in this case, actually, they're sequential, right? The sun rises and the grass then withers and then the flower falls and then its beauty perishes. And so here we have a general truth that is expressed in the narrative form. Aorist is the narrative form where we have sequential events one after another. So it actually makes a lot of sense that you would use the aorist here. So the question then for the tense, right? Is this, an example that would make us say, well, the epsilon cannot be tense because, we have this sort of timeless truth. So this is a quote unquote potential problem. And so what we have to say, and there are one of two things, right? We can say there's something else that's accounting for this. There's something else that's triggering this. Or we can say, well, maybe we should revise our definition of tense, or just say that epsilon is in tense. So those are kind of our options. I mean, I think if you look at nomics in general, they do have a certain characteristic, and that characteristic is that they refer to a class or in the case of the sun, like a single, like unique individual. So grass withers, the flower falls. So in English, we can do this in two ways. We can do it with the definite article, the, or we can do it with like what's called a bare plural. So we can say birds fly south for the winter, or, the swan flies south for the winter, meaning this particular type of swan, right? And, what we're saying is that whole class, we use that nominal form to refer to the whole class. And when we refer to the whole class, it is tenseless because it is something that the whole class does over and over and over again, right? That's kind of the idea.
So we read this text in James and we're like, oh, that's weird. They're using a past tense form to refer to a general truth. It should be a present tense form. Well, actually, the fact that we use a present tense form to refer to general truths in English is arbitrary. There's no reason the present tense should describe general truth any more than another tense should. But the perfective aspect, though, is important because these events, like you said, are telic in the sense that when you say the sun rises, it doesn't just keep rising indefinitely forever and ever. It rises, and then at some point it's reached the end point of rising, and then it starts setting, right? So the perfective aspect is really what's important here.
Yeah, and I should just say about the tense as well that, again, this in a lot of ways is an English problem because past tense does not necessarily mean not present. In English, when we say John ate, then we normally understand that to mean he is not still eating. So the question would be that, does the aorist always have this sort of like trigger of like past and not present? So here, the idea is that at least when it comes to when you refer to a class or a unique individual, not necessarily, right? Like that's the whole point, is that we don't have this inference that it's past and not present. It's just, it includes the past, right? Which is true, actually, because it is a general truth.
So what then are we saying about the aorist, the morphological form marked by the epsilon? Are we saying that it does encode a particular tense, it does encode a particular aspect, being perfective? Both, where are we landing on that question?
Yeah, so I would say that the epsilon does encode tense. And basically what happens is, in some contexts, you're going to have things that would require you to translate it into English as something other than past. But that does not necessarily mean that we should get rid of a tense analysis, because it just depends on how you define tense to begin with and how you account for this kind of data. And a lot of times what happens is it's just a retrojection of our English onto Greek on why we feel uncomfortable with how some of these forms are used.
Right. So like one aspect of how we've refined our notional category here, the notional category of tense, specifically past tense, is we've said, okay, past tense doesn't mean exclusively past tense without present or future being included in that.
So that's what we would have to say for something like James 1:11. We might say that this general truth, started in the past, and that's why it's used in the past, or something like that. I will be completely honest. There is more work to be done in this sense. What needs to be done is, someone needs to go through all of the gnomic aorist inside and outside of the Bible, right? Obviously you can't do it in all of Koine literature, but a large swath of it, and see, okay, what are the characteristics of these forms, and why are they used rather than the present, right? And there are gnomic statements with the present too, and so we need to compare those and see what are the elements, what's triggering the use of the aorist rather than the present, and there are reasons why these native speakers chose that form or this form over another one. And so that's what just has to be done. And maybe someone has done it. I don't know of someone that has.
I think, honestly, that's super helpful just practically for someone who's studying biblical Greek, even if they're not aiming to be a linguistics expert. Just when they're reading the text and they come across an example of an aorist that doesn't seem to fit their understanding of the aorist, I think the easy thing to do is just say, well, I know that it's typically translated this way, and that's fine. I'm just going to go with that. But now, that flag can be raised, and we at least have an immediate next step. Okay, is there anything in the context that might be causing it to be understood a little bit differently? And so that's what this is really about. Again, giving us some initial steps on how to start going about doing semantics or refining our notional categories. And I think that's a great step just for someone who's reading the biblical Greek text.
Yeah, and if I can just say one more thing about tense as well before I think we should move on to aspect actionsart, is our notion of tense that we have given, right, in this podcast, right, of a relationship between speech time and reference time is very simplistic. And if you read the linguistics literature, you will know that it's very simplistic, and it will not account for all of the data. If we just, have that definition, it just won't. Another classic example is just the present tense, right? The present tense is used in all kinds of different ways. And we, as English speakers, have, no qualms with saying that is present tense, right? But I can very easily say, something like, the year is 1941, Pearl Harbor has just been bombed, right? The year does not fit the definition of overlap between speech time and reference time. So the point is that we do creative things with the present tense all the time. And this is just totally normal. And people have noted this, and they've said, okay, well, maybe what we should do is define the present tense, or really tense in general, not as a relationship between the speech time and the reference time, but maybe as some sort of like temporal anchor. Some sort of temporal anchor in the context, which could be the speech time, but it could be the speech time for, different people within a story, all kinds of different things. And if we define it that way, then all of a sudden we can start to account for more examples, right? So one like classic example is, lege, which is said all the time, right, in past tense context in New Testament Greek. And this is very common, I think it's more common in classical Greek with thesi. But that being said, it's common in English, right? I can just say, Mary was walking around in the park when this guy comes up to her and says that he loves her. Again, when we hear that very short story, we say, oh, okay, I have no problem with you saying this guy comes up to her and says, both of which are present, and we know that they're just present relative to a different temporal anchor than the speaker in that moment. So this is something that we need anyway. We see across languages. It's easy to just implement for ancient Greek. And then we don't have to say that, these aren't counter examples to tense. They are a signpost that we should think more carefully about what tense is.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I think that with this podcast series, as I've been listening, at some point I kind of thought of tense as, okay, that's the easy category. I'm going to kind of like put that to the side and really need to focus on aspect because that's the one that gets really complex. But I think you just disproved that a little bit. And and my notional category of tense does need a little bit of refining, but that's really helpful.
I mean, there are people that spend their whole lives just trying to figure out the English present tense. You know, it's just like, I'm going to write a dissertation on the English present tense and figure out, because it's used in so many different ways. Right. And so again, like the point is that, you know, we just need to be more careful and think more carefully, and really don't just jump to, well, it's not present. Right. But what do we mean by present? Like, how can we account for the data and just cross-linguistically? Like, we need this cross-linguistically because it happens in language after language after language.
All right, yeah. So I think that's really helpful with tense. So why don't we move on and jump into talking a little bit about aspect and actionsart now?
Yeah. So this is one, again, that is debated a lot in biblical Greek studies or biblical Greek grammar. So one of the questions, a preliminary question, is just how do we define imperfective? Okay. So again, what we're thinking about is, you know, when we come to the data, is there data that would require us to refine our notional categories, right? So what we've said about imperfective is that the event time extends beyond the reference time, right? This is what we've said. And what that means is that, you know, the end point of a situation is not reached. And we hinted at refining this with the Yictol when we, talked about the Yictol form. We said the Yictol is not really an imperfective in that sense, right? We said, well, if we're going to call the Yictol imperfective, we need a different definition. And what we said is that, you know, maybe it gets its aspectual interpretation from the actionsart of the predicate. And I actually think that this is what's going on with the imperfective in Greek as well. And you can see this in different languages too. I mean, particularly English. So what we should expect with this is that you have overlap with the aorist, specifically with achievements. And the reason is that achievements are punctiliar, right? They don't have any duration. So when you say something like come, right, and this is the example we'll look at, there is a moment when someone has actually come. So the idea is that with a verb like come, you have to actually reach some sort of like, you know, proximity to the speaker. What's really important is that it's telic. There is an endpoint, and that endpoint is you reach some sort of, you know, space around the speaker. So we have an example like this in Matthew 8:9. Kai lego tuto poreotheti, kai porewatai, kai allo erhu, kai ergetai. This is the Roman centurion. I say to this one, go, and he goes. Poreotheti, kai porewatai. And to another, kai allo erhu, kai ergetai. Come, and he comes. So erhu, it just morphologically is not aorist. It's called present. It's imperfective, right? So the idea is that here he doesn't command someone to like be coming or like come closer, or he says come here, you know, like all the way here. When the Roman centurion is commanding someone, absolutely, right? And if they don't come and reach the end point of wherever he's telling them, then they haven't obeyed that order. So here we have, you know, the end point reached. And that's contrasted with Matthew 14:29. So here we have the same verb, right, in aorist. This is Jesus saying, "Hode epen elthe, kakatabas apotu ploiu hopetros peripatesen epitahudata," etc., etc. Well, then it says, "Kai elthen proston iesun." So he said, "Come," right, elthe. So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. So when Jesus says come, he means come all the way to me, right? Just like the Roman centurion. And so here we have identical forms in the sense that everything else is the same. We have an imperative with erchomai, same verb, and they both mean the same thing in the sense that the endpoint is reached. And so here we have clear overlap between the imperfective, and the aorist. And so this suggests that, again, we need to refine our category of what the imperfective is. The imperfective is just whatever the telicity of the predicate is, or the action side of the predicate. It's just taking that and putting it into our interpretation, right? That's the idea.
Right. And so that's very similar to what we talked about in the last episode with the biblical Hebrew form yiktol. What then is encoded in the morphology of an imperfective form in Greek? Like if it's not aspect, if aspect's not encoded, then what would we say is encoded in this morphological form?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So actually, I think it is interpreted really in opposition to the perfective. And so the point is that the perfective is encoding something, namely the end of the situation, or some sort of like maximal stage or something. Again, we can define that, or we can refine that a lot, and people have. But the point would be that what you have with the imperfective is, in some ways, it's a not aspect. It's just taking your predicate and saying, interpret me in this way, and the context, and interpret me in relation to how the system would dictate you use these forms. This is why the imperfective in Greek often has an interpretation that is equivalent to the progressive in English, because the contrast in Greek is between perfective and imperfective. Whereas in English, actually, I would say that the contrast is between a progressive, which says that you're in the midst of a situation, versus an imperfective in this sense. So we're going to have telic predicates interpreted as the endpoint being reached because it's being contrasted with a form that says telic predicates are not reached. So we have the exact opposite in Greek, because perfective says, right, that the endpoint is reached. And so when we contrast that with a form that doesn't say that, then we often get something that's more equivalent to the progressive in English.
Kind of another follow-up question. Here in these two examples, Matthew 8, we have the imperfective with achievements, and we see how we interpret that as overlapping with how we would just interpret an aorist like we see in Matthew 14. Kind of going back to a question I asked about another text, I mean, is there any reason here in Matthew 8 that the imperfective would have been chosen instead of the aorist? Does it contribute something unique to the context?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I honestly have no clue. There is probably some sort of nuanced difference. This would be like really hard to get at without a native speaker, right? Because either way, it's very clear that the endpoint is reached. So that means that that's not where the difference lies. And so the point here is that in its aspectual interpretation, it is identical in this case. And so, and there probably was some sort of different feeling you got about the two verbs and some sort of like nuanced difference, but it doesn't seem to be temporal.
Yeah, I'm just kind of spitballing here, but one clear difference between the context to me seems to be that in Matthew 8, he's not talking about like one specific event in the world. I mean, it's almost like a habitual. He's saying like what he does generally. I say to this one, go, and he goes. Not one time, a single event in the world, but just in general, he does these events. Whereas in Matthew 14, it is one specific event that happened in the world. I don't know what that would have to do with the imperfective, but it's just something I notice about the different contexts.
No, actually, if you found that across context, that would actually explain it very well. Right? Because imperfectives are more common with habituals because it doesn't say that the endpoint has been reached, right? And so basically what you have here is some sort of like telic habitual, where each time the centurion says to do something, they do it. But what is interesting about this context as well in Matthew 8 is that it's actually surrounded by other aorist imperatives, right? And so again, the point is that there's clearly overlap, right? Proeuteti, right? Aorist. Boieson tuto, aorist. So the issue is that we still do have to account for this sort of like identity in meaning in these kinds of contexts.
Right. And we probably just have to be okay with there being multiple ways to express the same idea in any given language. I mean, there doesn't always have to be a specific reason that a native speaker chose one form over another. Sometimes there is just overlap.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes there is, or it's just like reasons that we just aren't sure of. But there is certainly overlap between forms. Like, we have to say that, and I mentioned this earlier, the and bear plurals, right? Like, the polar bear eats seals versus, polar bears eat seal. It's interpreted the same, right? It doesn't mean that the bear plural, polar bears, and the definite article mean the same thing. That's not what it means. It means that they have a semantics that allows them to be used for the same function, right? And that's the key. And so here, in the same way, we're not saying that the imperfective is identical to the aorist. We're saying that we have to give a semantics to each one that allows them to be used the same way in particular contexts, specifically with these kinds of contexts with telic predicates.
Yeah, that's really helpful. So why don't we move on and talk about the perfect now?
So I think probably the most important thing to note about the perfect is just that it's not necessarily a marker of pragmatic prominence. It doesn't mean that the information conveyed in that sentence with the perfect is prominent in discourse in some way. So, this is a fairly popular position in New Testament studies. And just to point out that it's just not how the perfect works in really any language, that you would always see prominence with this. To put it simply, verb forms are markers of temporal relations. And this is what we saw with Nora. And that doesn't mean that sometimes other kinds of information aren't triggered by that. But I think a big problem within New Testament studies with the perfect has been there has been less attention paid to the actual semantic meaning of the form, the temporal relation that's encoded. And instead, we've talked about prominence, but really that's putting the cart before the horse. You have to first figure out what is the temporal relationship for this specific instance of the perfect. And really, Steve pointed this out in our conversation as well, that, he goes through and looks at different perfects and says, okay, it's not necessarily pragmatically prominent. There's more going on, more discourse particles and all kinds of things that might mark prominence. That just to point out that it's not just the perfect that marks something as necessarily prominent. So what we really need to do is start with the semantics. And again, in that volume, The Greek Verb Revisited, Robert Krellin's article actually does a good job of introducing this, of really going through some of the issues, right? So he has a semantic framework and he goes through some of the issues. Okay, we have these different interpretations of the perfect. And our question is, how do we account for them? Right. And that's really the question that you have to ask yourself first. So the best place to start is just with these different interpretations of the perfect to see why they arise, how they arise in different contexts with different verbs. And then we can talk about prominence once we've established the temporal relationships in each of the contexts, because actually the prominence will be affected by the kind of perfect that we have in that context. Because actually there are pragmatic inferences of the perfect. So one is, the lifetime effect, for example, but that arises under a certain temporal reading of the perfect. There's a link between the temporal interpretation, and we'll talk more about the lifetime effect later on. But so there's a link between the temporal interpretation and the potential pragmatic significance.
So the point here is that we have the perfect. It does encode that kind of aspectual value that we've talked about into the morphology, in the sense that the event time precedes the reference time, and the reference time's in the present. But just like we've seen with many other examples, the way that it interacts in context kind of gives us all sorts of different interpretations. And so the way that we do semantics and really just the way that we read biblical Greek is to take all of those elements into account. We need to have a theory of the perfect, and again, what's encoded in the morphology, what it contributes to every context, that invariable meaning that we've talked about. But we also have to look at the action start of the predicate, right? Because that's going to contribute something to the interpretation as well, and just looking at how those things interact with one another.
Yeah, exactly. And there are actually lots of interesting things about the perfect and how we understand it. But I think part of the issue is that some of this work hasn't been done enough of us carefully considering, okay, what is the action side of the predicate, and then what kinds of interpretations do we get with the perfect in those cases. And so this is something that honestly, within general linguistics, it's very well known. You can read one article on the perfect and see exactly how states and events differ in this respect. So the point is for us in just how we analyze these forms is when we want to determine the significance of a form in context, we have to look at all the different elements, right? We have to first come up with an interpretation. We have to have a theory of the perfect that accounts for these sorts of different interpretations. I will just say to end, one interesting significant thing about the perfect is the lifetime effect that you have in English, right? And so this isn't actually true in languages outside of English. It is in some languages that you have for the perfect. But this is something that could be investigated with Greek. And I don't know if it has been. I assume it hasn't been. But you have this contrast, something like Einstein visited Paris versus Einstein has visited Paris. This is actually really, really interesting. And this is a problem. It's a problem because Einstein has visited Paris should be completely fine in English. We can just say it's an experiential perfect, right? It happened in the past. We're talking about what Einstein has done. We say he has visited Paris. But for whatever reason, it sounds very funny to us to say Einstein has visited Paris because of what's called the lifetime effect, where if we use the perfect, we normally think of the subject as still being alive, right? So Einstein visited Paris is completely fine. Einstein has visited Paris is just weird. Again, this is the kind of thing that is significant exegetically in a certain context cycle. Whether or not the Greek has this sort of lifetime effect affects our understanding of certain passages. But that's the thing that you first have to do, the work of, okay, what is the meaning of the perfect? How does it interact with actionsart and other elements in the clause? And then what are these sorts of pragmatic inferences that we get? Where should I expect them? Why do I get them? And then we can start seeing, okay, here is how the perfect is significant exegetically, instead of just saying, we know the perfect is significant and then searching for ways it's significant.
Right. Kind of as I reflect on this whole series, and we've talked some about, okay, what's the takeaway for the audience? And there's kind of been a couple different forms of that. Some people need to specialize in linguistics. And the takeaway of this series and this episode, we see going through this process of doing semantics, accounting for the data, refining our notional categories, etc. But just a more formal way. If you're the person that's going to go specialize in linguistics and be part of this effort to kind of better integrate linguistics with the biblical languages. But I'm also reflecting on myself as someone that I don't think is going to do that. And I still have these very practical takeaways, really going through the same process, but in a more informal way as I engage with the text of the Greek New Testament, reading, coming across an aorist that's behaving differently than I expect it to, and going through these steps of, okay, is there something going on with the actionsart of the predicate, and asking some of those questions. And what occurs to me is something that is so important for that is building intuitions about the language, because those flags aren't going to go up for me if I don't have intuitions about how Greek typically works, or how I've seen the aorist behave in a ton of different contexts. The red flag's not going to go up for me when it's behaving differently, because I'm not going to notice that it's behaving differently. And so, I just think a very practical kind of thing that I've taken away from this is if I want to avoid some of these mistakes that we've talked about without becoming an expert in linguistics, one of the best ways to do that is to read the text a lot and be familiar with the data And that's why it's important not only to read as much text as you can, but also to actively produce the language through speaking and writing. What happens when you do that is you encounter those scenarios where you're trying to produce the language in order to describe a particular event or scenario, and you ask the question, oh, which form should I use here? And that forces you to go to the data, go to the text, and interact with it in a different way than if you're just reading it passively. You're going to it asking, how would they have described this scenario? And then you go look for data that tells you that. And so it causes you to interact with the data in a different way. And so the way that you build those intuitions is both by reading as much text as you possibly can, interacting with the data as much as you can, but also trying to actively produce it and refining your own production with the data itself.
Yeah, I think that's huge. I think, these categories they're super important, right? Like it's very important to have these sorts of notional categories in our head and then to think deeply about how to refine them, which is what we've tried to do here. But at the end of the day, it is very, very hard to analyze a language you don't know. In order for us to progress, we have to start building intuitions about what the language means and how it works. And then you're right. We start to ask different questions. We start to ask things like, how did they say this meaning that I know in English, right? How did they convey that same meaning in Greek? Once we have that question, it changes the way we read the text, because at the end of the day, we have intuitions. It's just that when we don't have Greek intuitions, we just implant first language intuitions, English or whatever.
Yeah. I think that's a great place to end really practical takeaways from not just this episode, but this whole series that we've been working on. So that's all we have time for on this episode. Thank you to all of our listeners out there who have taken the time to listen to the Biblical Languages podcast brought to you by Biblingo. We hope you enjoyed the episode.
Thank you for listening to the Biblical Languages podcast brought to you by Biblingo. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app and leave us a review. You can also follow Biblingo on social media to discuss the episode with us and other listeners. And don't forget to visit biblingo.org to start your 10-day free trial of Biblingo.